The night the elders came for my son's cradle, I stood in the doorway with an axe trembling in my hands, torchlight flickering across faces I had known my whole life, faces now hardened by fear. Behind me, my son Samuel lay burning with fever, his small chest rising and falling too fast, too shallow. Thomas gripped my shoulder, and Elder Simon's voice cut through the smoke. "Destroy it, Grace, or watch your son die." I looked at the golden cradle my husband had carved with his own hands, the most beautiful thing I had ever owned, and I understood, in that terrible moment, that I was about to lose one love to save another. I did not know it then, but the curse the village feared was never truly in the wood, or in the gold leaf Thomas had pressed so carefully into its carvings. It lived in the whispers we let grow unchecked, and in the pride we wore like a second skin without ever noticing its weight. If stories like this one, carrying the warmth and wisdom of village life, mean something to you, stay with me until the end, and consider subscribing so more of these tales find their way to you. But to understand how I came to raise that axe over the only cradle my son ever knew, you must first know how our story began, long before Samuel ever took his first breath. My name is Grace, and for 7 long years, I prayed for a child who would not come. I lived with my husband, Thomas, in a small mud brick home at the edge of our village, where the fields rolled down toward the river, and the hills stood watch like old, patient grandfathers. Thomas was a woodcarver, gentle-handed and quiet, the kind of man who spoke rarely but meant every word when he did. We had married young, full of hope, and every season that passed without a child felt like a door quietly closing somewhere inside me. The women of the village were kind, mostly, but kindness has its own way of wounding. "Perhaps next season, Grace," they would say, patting my hands, and I would smile and swallow the ache that lived just beneath my ribs. Thomas never once made me feel less than whole. On the nights when my sorrow grew too heavy to hide, he would sit beside me under the fig tree behind our home and remind me that our story was not yet finished. "The river does not rush to reach the sea," he told me once. "It simply keeps flowing, and one day it arrives." I did not always believe him, but I loved him for believing it enough for the both of us. Then, in my 8th year of waiting, I felt a flutter beneath my heart that I dared not name aloud until the healer, an old and steady woman named Ruth, confirmed what I already suspected in my bones. I was carrying a child. When I told Thomas, he did not speak for a long moment. He simply knelt in the dirt outside our home and pressed his forehead to my belly, and I felt his tears before I heard them. Samuel was born on a clear morning in the dry season, announced by a cry so strong it startled the birds from the fig tree. I remember holding him for the first time and thinking that every year of waiting, every whispered pity from the village women, every quiet night of grief had led me to this single moment of impossible joy. Thomas wept openly that day, unashamed, cradling his son as though Samuel were made of morning light. It was Thomas who first spoke of the cradle. "A child who was prayed for this long deserves something worthy of the wait," he said. And I laughed, thinking he meant a simple wooden frame like every other family owned. But Thomas had other plans. For 3 months he disappeared into his workshop each evening after the fields were tended, and I would hear the soft, patient scrape of his tools long after the rest of the village had gone quiet. He would not let me see it until it was finished, and when at last he carried it into our home, I understood why. The cradle was unlike anything I had seen in our village. Thomas had carved it from a single piece of dark, fine-grained wood, shaped with flowing lines that seemed to move even when it stood still, adorned with birds and vines and the sun rising over hills. Along its edges, he had pressed thin sheets of gold leaf, bought with savings I did not know we had, so that the carvings caught the light and seemed almost alive with fire. It looked less like furniture and more like something carried down from a chief's household, or from a story told to frighten children into good behavior. "Thomas," I whispered, running my fingers along the gleaming wood. "This is too much." "Nothing is too much for him," Thomas said, nodding toward Samuel, sleeping peacefully in my arms. "Let the village see how loved this boy is." I should have listened more closely to my own hesitation that night, though I did not know it then. Pride, I would later learn, rarely announces itself. It simply settles into a home wearing the face of love, and it is only in hindsight that you can tell the two apart. Word of the golden cradle spread through the village faster than smoke on a still evening. Neighbors came, one by one, with polite excuses to visit and admire the new baby, though I knew from the way their eyes lingered on the cradle rather than on Samuel exactly what had drawn them. Most offered warm congratulations. Martha, my closest friend since girlhood, simply laughed and said, "Grace, only you and Thomas would turn a wooden bed into a small sun." I laughed with her, grateful, not yet aware that not everyone in the village shared her warmth. It was Naomi, a neighbor whose own children had grown thin during a hard season the year before, who first gave voice to what others were only thinking. I overheard her outside the market one afternoon, speaking low to another woman. "A cradle fit for a chief's son in a farmer's home," she said. "Some families forget their place. The spirits do not forget so easily." I told myself she spoke from old jealousy and nothing more, and perhaps that was true. But her words did not stay contained to that afternoon. They traveled from home to home, gathering weight the way small stones gather into a landslide, until even the elders began to speak of the cradle in low, uneasy voices whenever Thomas and I were out of earshot. I noticed the change slowly. Fewer visitors came to admire Samuel. Conversations quieted when I approached the well. Elder James, the oldest and gentlest of our village leaders, still greeted me kindly, but even his eyes carried a question he did not ask aloud. I told Thomas none of this at first, not wanting to trouble him, though I suspect he noticed it too, in his own quiet way. The trouble that followed did not begin with Samuel. It began 3 months later with the youngest son of a farmer near the eastern fields, a boy who woke one morning burning with fever and could not be cooled by any of Ruth's remedies. Within 2 weeks, 4 more children had fallen ill with the same strange sickness, each one weaker than the last, despite full bellies and careful care. The village, already frightened by a poor harvest that season, began searching for a reason behind the suffering, the way people always do when the world stops making sense to them. I did not think of the cradle at all when the sickness first began. I was too consumed with worry for Samuel, watching him for any sign of the fever that had claimed the other children, praying each night that whatever had settled over our village would pass him by. For a time, it seemed my prayers were answered. Samuel grew, strong and curious, taking his first unsteady steps across our floor, while I wept with relief, and Thomas laughed until his sides ached. But relief, I have learned, is often only sickness resting before it returns with greater strength. It was Elder Simon, harsher and more fearful than Elder James, who first spoke the accusation aloud in the gathering beneath the old baobab tree. I was not there myself, but Martha told me every word later, her voice shaking with the injustice of it. "Since when," Elder Simon had demanded of the assembled village, "has a common family slept their son in gold fit for royalty, while our children waste away in sickness? The spirits do not forgive pride so easily forgiven by men." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, fed by months of quiet resentment and fresh fear. Elder James tried to calm the gathering, reminding them that sickness had visited villages before, with or without golden cradles to blame. But fear rarely listens to reason once it has found somewhere convenient to rest. That very week, Samuel's own strength began to falter. What started as a small cough became a fever that would not break, no matter how many cool clods Ruth pressed to his forehead, or how many bitter herbs she coaxed past his lips. I sat beside his cradle through 3 sleepless nights, watching his small chest rise and fall, bargaining with every ancestor and god I could remember. Thomas sat with me in silence, his carving hands useless now, against the one thing he could not shape or mend. "It is not the cradle, Grace," he told me on the second night, though I noticed he would not look at it as he said it. "It cannot be the cradle." I wanted with everything in me to believe him. By the 4th night, word had reached every home in the village that Samuel, the very child the golden cradle had been carved for, now lay closest to death of all the sick children. Whatever quiet sympathy had remained for our family turned swiftly into accusation. I remember Ruth arriving that evening, her face grave in a way I had not seen before, telling me gently that his fever had climbed higher than any of the others. and that she had exhausted every remedy she knew. "There is still hope, Grace," she said, though her eyes did not entirely agree with her words. That same night, torchlight gathered outside our home. I heard the voices before I saw the faces, a crowd of neighbors, friends, and strangers, led by Elder Simon, their fear sharpened into something that looked dangerously close to anger. Elder James walked among them too, though his face carried more sorrow than certainty. Even Naomi stood at the edge of the crowd, and for a moment, when our eyes met, I thought I saw something like regret flicker across her face, though it vanished before I could be sure. Thomas opened the door before they could knock, and I stood behind him, with Samuel burning against my chest, too weak now even to cry properly. His small whimpers, the only sound I could hear, over the pounding of my own heart. Elder Simon stepped forward first. "The sickness will not leave this village," he said, "while pride still sits gleaming in a poor man's house. Destroy the cradle, Grace, and let the spirits see your humility, or watch your son join the others we have already buried this season." Behind him, the crowd murmured its agreement, and somewhere in that sea of firelight and fear, I heard someone weeping, though I could not tell if it was for Samuel or for themselves. I do not know, even now, whether I believed the cradle itself carried any curse at all. Ruth herself had told me privately, days before, that such sicknesses had swept through neighboring villages long before Thomas had ever lifted a carving knife, and that fear often found the nearest convenient thing to blame. But standing in that doorway, with my son's breath growing shallower with each passing minute, I understood something that mattered far more than whether the accusation was true. My village needed to believe that peace was still possible, and I needed, more than anything else I had ever wanted, for my son to live long enough to grow tired of my worrying. Thomas pressed the axe into my hands without a word, his own eyes wet and steady on mine, and I understood that he was giving me a choice he could not bear to make for me. I walked to the corner of our home, where the golden cradle stood, its carved birds and vines catching the torchlight one final time, and for one long breath, I allowed myself to grieve it, this beautiful, impossible thing, born from 7 years of longing, and every ounce of love my husband knew how to give. Then I lifted the axe, and I brought it down. The wood split easily beneath the blade, gold leaf curling away like petals torn from a flower, and I did not stop until the golden cradle that had once held my son's first sleeping breaths lay in broken pieces at my feet. I knelt among the wreckage, with Samuel still clutched against my chest, tears mixing with the sweat on his burning skin, and I begged whatever spirits were listening, ancestors or God, or simply the quiet dark itself. I wish I could tell you that Samuel's fever broke the very moment the cradle fell to splinters, at some ancient curse lifted the instant my pride lay shattered on the floor. The truth is gentler and more ordinary than that. His fever held through that night and into the next morning, and it was only as the sun rose that I felt his small body finally cool beneath my hands, his breathing settling into something slow and steady for the first time in days. Whether it was Ruth's herbs, the passing of whatever sickness had gripped the village, or simply a mother's stubborn prayers finally being answered, I cannot say with certainty. What I can tell you is that by week's end, every sick child in the village, including Samuel, had begun to recover, one by one, as quietly as the illness had first arrived. The village that had gathered with torches outside my door came again in the weeks that followed, though this time they came with baskets of grain and quiet apologies mumbled more often through actions than through words. Elder Simon never spoke directly of that night again, though he began greeting Thomas with a respect he had not shown before, a small kindness that told me more than any apology could have. Even Naomi came, one gray morning, carrying a woven blanket for Samuel, and in awkward silence I chose to fill with forgiveness rather than blame. Fear, I had come to understand, makes fools of good people as easily as it makes villains of bad ones, and holding on to anger for it would only have carved a new wound, or an old one had finally begun to heal. Thomas carved Samuel a new cradle that autumn, plain and unadorned, cut from the same fig tree beneath which he had once promised me our story was not yet finished. It held no gold, no elaborate birds or vines, nothing that caught the eye or invited envy. It held only my son, sleeping soundly through nights that no longer frightened me. I understood, watching him there, that I had learned the hardest and simplest lesson of my life. True wealth was never gold pressed into carved wood, nor the admiration of neighbors, nor even the beautiful things love sometimes convinces us we deserve. True wealth was the sound of my son's steady breathing in the dark, the safety of my family gathered whole beneath one humble roof, and nothing the world could offer would ever be worth risking that again. Samuel is a grown man now, with children of his own, and he sleeps his own babies in cradles as plain and sturdy as the one his father carved after that terrible season. Sometimes, when the evening is quiet and the fig tree casts its long shadow across our yard, I tell him this story, not as a warning against beautiful things, but as a reminder of what truly deserves our devotion. Thank you for sitting with me through Grace's story tonight. If it moved you, carry its quiet lesson with you, and I will see you in the next tale.